Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast, and others of you are joining us on our digital platforms. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Tonight, preserving Black books. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff, and our guests are joining us remotely. Black books are under attack, the target of banned book lists and political campaigns to strip local and school libraries of books about race and gender. And the small group of Black bookstores is getting smaller, squeezed by COVID-related distribution problems, dwindling inventory, and the uptick of consumers who read ebooks. What's more, major publishers have traditionally published low numbers of books by authors of color. Black published authors make up only 6% of all published authors. These multiple challenges have sparked a broad-based effort to preserve Black books. But first, Professor Renée Landers from Suffolk University School of Law joins us to discuss the leaked opinion draft from the Supreme Court. The draft indicates a majority of justices support overturning the High Court's 1973 landmark decision, Roe v. Wade. If the leaked draft is correct, what would that mean for Black and other women of color? Renée, thanks for joining us.
Hello.
Here's a context. 1 out of every 4 women, American women, get an abortion. They're between the ages of 15 and 44, but half of those abortions are by women who are Black and Latino. Speak about the impact of the overturning of Roe in that context.
Well, the overturning of Roe, as your statistics indicate, will have a disproportionate effect on Black women and other women of color. To the extent that they live in states that will immediately enact abortion bans, or which already have done so in anticipation of this Supreme Court ruling, they will have to travel out of state in order to obtain abortions. And for many, that is not economically possible.
Now, we're talking about 13 states that have so-called trigger laws that'll go into place if Roe is overturned, meaning an immediate law that would ban abortions. Something that that most women are taking advantage of, though the statistics are not clear about how many women of color, are medical abortions, so-called, where you
Correct.
take 2 pills. Can that be impacted by the overturning of Roe?
So that is a more complicated question. And I think that, yes, those same states are now moving on to that next, procedure. About half of abortions now are accomplished using that medical, medical approach as opposed to a surgical approach. So then you get into issues about whether it would be possible for a state to ban, shipments of these drugs into the state. And I think there are constitutional problems with that. There are, under the Commerce Clause, not to get too nerdy about this, but Congress is in charge of regulating interstate commerce, and states have limited opportunity to interfere with interstate commerce, and that's what those bans would do. So I think that is a more problematic avenue for these states.
Now, you've mentioned something that I hadn't thought of in terms of a new report that's just come out about the decline in numbers of physicians of color. How does that play out in a scenario where Roe may be overturned, and as we've said, half of all women who are getting abortions are Black and Latino?
So I think that there are sort of 2 things. One is that for a long time, the medical profession, to its credit, has recognized that it's very problematic that there are so few physicians of color in the country, that physicians of color disproportionately serve large numbers of patients of color. And also, as we saw during COVID, physicians of color and other healthcare providers of color can be trusted messengers for public health information. And so I think by, if the supply and the number of physicians of color shrinks, that will further, imperil the health of Black women and other Black patients, because it's a more pervasive problem in the healthcare system, which is only exacerbated in the context of reproductive health services.
Do you fear a return to pre-COVID days where everything goes underground and there's more danger to women trying to actually self-abort?
Well, in the pre-Roe days, yes. So I think that first of all, there are a lot of states. About half the states will still, at least in theory, have more liberal abortion laws, which make abortion available. And I think that those states and the reproductive health care organizations in those states will work very hard to try to raise the funds so that women will have this opportunity to have a safe and legal procedure to which they should be entitled. And so I think that that is the most important thing. I think also that people have to be wary of these crisis pregnancy centers, which masquerade as healthcare centers, but they're very focused on persuading women not to have abortions. And, people can make their own choice about whether to have an abortion or not. But these centers masquerade as healthcare centers, delay people's access to real healthcare services, and then put them at risk of not being able actually to have a legal abortion. So I think that the other risk here is making women aware that these organizations exist and to really go to trusted reproductive healthcare clinics who will provide healthcare.
Very quickly, Renee, this is a draft opinion, but do you believe that it probably is the final decision?
I think there might be some tweaks. I think that the people who voted in that majority, we're not quite sure where Chief Justice Roberts sits in all of this. I think they're not necessarily amenable to any of the arguments about the risks that their decision poses for women's health and the impact on reproductive health services generally, even for women even who want to carry a pregnancy to term.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now to our main discussion. Joining us remotely, Carmen Fields. She's an award-winning TV host and journalist and writer, and is being honored for contributing a collection of books written by Black authors to Salem State University Library. Marita Golden, a literary consultant, writing coach, and an award-winning author of many books, including her latest, The Strong Black Woman, and the co-founder of the Hurston Wright Foundation. Kim McLarin, professor and interim dean of graduate and professional studies at Emerson College. She is also an award-winning author of several books. Her latest is James Baldwin's Another Country, bookmarked. And Carolyn Kautsire, professor at Bunker Hill Community College and author of What Kind of Girl. Welcome to all of you. I want to start this, glad to have you. I want to start this way because all of you are authors, and so it may seem a simple question, but why not each of you weigh in on why it is important to preserve Black books? I'm going to start with you, Marita Golden.
Well, it's important to preserve Black books because Black books are an important part of the American and the world consciousness, the American and the world creative and literary and intellectual heritage. We often don't think of Black books in that larger concept, but that's my reasoning for the importance of the work that all of us do. And I think that as someone who came of age in the late 1960s and early 70s, where there was this huge renaissance and republishing of a lot of Black books that had been banned, that had been allowed to go out of print, to see what's happening today is really, really disheartening. So we're not just preserving an American legacy or a Black legacy, we're preserving a global world legacy. Because when you think of writers like Zora Neale Hurston, Richard Wright, so many of our artists, they have been loved all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Kim.
Yeah, I would second that. I think it is Henry Louis Gates who says, in many ways, African-American literature is unique in the history of the world because nowhere else have a people who were enslaved. Of course, slavery existed in many other cultures and many other times, but have a people who were enslaved created themselves, and out of that enslavement created a literature that testified to their desire to be free and to their humanity and to everything else, right? So African-American literature has transformed the world. not only in the United States, and it is vital. It speaks to everything, every aspect of humanity. And so it is vital both for people of color and Black people in particular, because it represents them, but it also it's just a human literature that speaks to what it means to be human. And so we desperately need those books because we desperately need to keep progressing in our humanity in this country and in this society and in this world.
Caroline?
And speaking of progress, I think that it is a way to preserve history because we need to know where we've come from if we're going to contribute to that progress. And yes, it's about honoring legacy. We acknowledge the hard work that other people have done in the past and celebrate that Black excellence at the end of the day. I think it's about preserving Black culture and understanding the different traditions that have come up in the past, whether we're going to hold on to them or evolve in a different way. So yes, I think it's very much about preserving history.
And Carmen?
Ditto to what everyone else has said. I come from it a little bit differently, having been a product of segregated schools in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and being exposed in many ways to our literature, and then going into the majority population when I was in grad school and quoting and referring to some of these works, only to discover that my classmates had never even heard of these people and these particular works and traditions. So it's important for us to preserve, but it's also important for the greater society and world to be aware.
And so you've taken a very specific step, Carmen, personally, by gathering up a lot of the books and materials that you spoke about and passing it on to the second generation. Talk about what you've done with your Carmen Fields collection at Salem State Library.
Well, to put it at a basic level, during the pandemic, there's only so much Scrabble you can play. There's only so many movies you can binge watch. And I am admittedly a pack rat. And so it became time, I thought, a good use of time to sort and declutter my possessions. And one of my most prized possessions is my books. But I didn't want to just give them away willy-nilly. I felt like, I guess, a mother getting ready to put her children in foster care. I wanted the family to stay together to the extent possible. And luckily, I found a listening ear, a willing acceptance of the donation of a collection of books by Black authors that I'm donating. So
you say the collection is about 500 books, and these but you have way more than that in your personal collection. So why these particular 500?
Because those are the ones that are most important to me. And it's books by Black authors and other authors who have written about Black subject matter or minority subject matter. For example, some of my Amy Tan books are included in the collection, but the overwhelming majority of them are by Black authors, and those are the ones that are most precious to me, that I've held on to since I was in high school and even before, and through college, through grad school, through book club, and that was why that was selected.
Now, following up, Marita, you mentioned the books that ended up being reprinted, some of them, or brought forth again during the civil rights and women's movement that were out of print for a while, and now some of them again have gone out of print. I'm sure many of them are in Carmen's collection. But you, too, have a formal Black books preservation program through the Wright Foundation, where you're supporting writers, of course, to produce these products. Talk about that.
Well, the Zora Hurston Richard Wright Foundation is now 32 years old. And I'm very proud that the first important decision that I made was to co-found it with Clyde McIlvaine. The second most important decision was to turn it over to a new generation of leadership. I think that's really important to keep these institutions infused with new ideas, new people. And if you have a brilliant idea, it will find manifestation in the next generation. But what we've been doing at Hurston Wright for 32 years is creating community, creating a safe space for the creation, realization of Black stories and narratives, so that we have the Summer Writers Workshop, we have fellowship, we have connections with several universities where we have writers come and do residences. We also offer the Legacy Award, which is kind of the Oscars of Black literature every fall, where we honor the best Black writers of published fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. We honor cultural activists and innovators. And for 30 years, along with organizations like VONA, Cave Canem, we've really been creating in a very intentional way the next generation of Black writers, so that we're creating opportunities for them. And we've had a really profound impact, so that even though only 6% of all writers in America who are published are Black, organizations like Hurston Wright are responsible for a lot of that percentage. So it's been very gratifying to do that work.
Caroline, you're part of that next generation of writers, your new book, What Kind of Girl? Talk to me about what you're teaching your students that helps to underscore the overall mission of preserving Black books and cultural heritage.
Well, I think the first thing they need to understand is if we're talking about the Black experience, there's definitely intersectionality that's going on there. My students are coming in with, different demographics, and I help them kind of understand their place in the narratives that we talk about in class. I think that one thing that helps is my Malawian identity. And when I share some of my stories and how I understand my place in society, it kind of inspires my students to also share their stories, share their place in society. And because they're trying to find their voices, they're trying to figure out who they are. And we talk about things like African narratives. I know one thing that has kind of awoken a lot of people to the power of narratives is knowing that we have a lot of negative narratives about Africa. And it's time to have new narratives. We don't want these narratives about, Africans always need saving. Africans are always the victims, and somebody needs to come in to save them. But we have other narratives. And when I share my book, What Kind of Girl, with my students, I say, yeah, this is like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, but it's an African family. And they see that they can actually do that too with their own stories. You don't have to write a story about, the most tragic thing, the most exciting thing. These are just stories that need to be told. And I inspire my students to do that because there is so much liberation in telling your own narrative.
So Kim, one of the threats to, of course, the preservation of Black books has been, but appears to be ramped up now, the targeted banning of the material by Black authors in states and schools and libraries and part of these campaigns, some of these political campaigns. Talk about what critical impact that has, as well as your experience with your students in the classroom in terms of trying to preserve this material and shore up these authors.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, what the bans against, for example, Toni Morrison's great novel, The Bluest Eye, right, which is one of the most banned books in America, and it proceeds from there. What these bans are, America American society is, I like to say, and James Baldwin said, is consistently focused on innocence, right? This kind of willful innocence, this denial of reality, this denial of culpability, this denial of responsibility. And what artists do, what Black books do particularly, and especially Black women, Black female books, is challenge that, right? It challenges that willful innocence. We didn't do anything, we're not responsible. And that's very threatening and very damaging, but it's also critical for society to evolve, as Caroline was saying, to progress, right? So that's why books by Black authors are so often banned, because they challenge the prevailing narrative and they want to expand the narrative. It's why the whole 1619 project has become so fraught, right? It challenges the existing dominant narrative. And that's uncomfortable for people, but it's vital and it's necessary. And so that's what I do in my classroom. That's the whole point of education. That's the whole point of reading. That's the whole point of literature. James Baldwin said, artists are here to disturb the peace. That's our job. That's what we do. That's what books do. And it's necessary and critical if a society is not going to collapse upon itself.
One of the things that I know that maybe some of the young people, this next generation, don't get, which makes the collections, Carmen, like yours, more valuable, is that they maybe not have had to have that first experience of seeing a book by a Black author and what that does for you if you've never seen it before. So both you and Kim have just startling stories about that. Kim, I'm gonna start with you. Tell me about the first book the first Black book you saw.
Oh yeah, I remember very clearly. I always loved reading, like many writers, right from the beginning, and I even loved writing stories. But it never occurred to me that I could be a writer until one day. I think I was 7th grade, might have been 8th grade. I went to the library because we always went to the library, and I saw on the shelf Maya Angelou's beautiful face on the back of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. It was the first time. Now I had read, by 7th or 8th grade, I'd read hundreds of books. I mean, I was a vociferous reader, but I had never read a book by a Black person until then. I didn't know Black people could be writers, let alone Black women. It was revelatory. And that is the importance for us of representation of Black. And of course, it's also just a classic. It's a brilliant book. And she was wonderful. So I will never forget that moment. That is literally the moment that showed me that I could become what I was really born to become.
Carmen, add to that.
Well, I'm trying to scratch my head and remember the very first book that was impactful. One thing that is a fond memory, when I was about in the 4th or 5th grade, one of the parents of my friends started a book club for us, and where we would meet and exchange books and talk about the books. Perhaps my earliest memory of an impactful book was in middle school or junior high school. I attended Marian Anderson Junior High School, and we were required to study about Marian Anderson. So one of the first books that I was exposed to formally in class was her biography. And I was just stunned by what she had accomplished and under the circumstances which she accomplished those things. And I was sold on reading and stories to inspire after that.
Marita.
Well, I'm going to be very honest and say that I can't remember the first Black book that changed things for me, but I do remember that every night my father told me bedtime stories from Black history, so that he was this great raconteur who did not have a lot of formal education, but who was a voracious reader. He read everything. He read Tolstoy, he read J.A. Rogers. And so he would come into my room, and before I would go to sleep, we would talk about Frederick Douglass. We would talk about Sojourner Truth. We would talk about the fact that one of the Cleopatras was actually a Black woman. We would talk about Hannibal. And so I, from a very early age, was given Black narrative as something that was important. Now, it was very hard for me to find books. My father had a collection of books that codified the knowledge he was giving me. And I'll never forget, in one of the classes, I think I was in the 5th grade, and the teacher, who was white, said that she didn't enslave people, but she said the slaves were happy. So I raised my hand and told her that my father had told me that the slaves were not happy and that they wanted to be free. And so I was raised on Black narrative, and it was really kind of wonderful because it was just very informal. It was just woven into my life. And when my father showed me books written by J.A. Rogers, the great didactic historian of Great Men of Color, and other books, it was like this secret that we had that was ours, but I knew it was very precious.
Now, Caroline, you're in a different generation, so I wonder if it had the same impact for you, your first Black book or by a Black author.
Very, very different for me because I started high school when I was 9 years old. So the books I was reading when I was much younger were stories like Timve and Tala, just about two kids going to school and figuring out life, and a story called Nyenye Zitita, which means Tito of the stars. And it was just about Black beauty. And I remember listening to these stories in my classroom, but I don't think I could make the connection to my life yet, that this is going to be important. I was actually a terrible writer and reader when I was in high school, because I was busy reading Shakespeare and other things that at first I could not relate with, but I eventually developed a love for it. So when I turned 27 and I was already a professor, I was kind of...
Caroline,
Yes.
I'm going to have to, we are out of time. I'm going to have to rest it right there and pick it up in the digital platform part of this, because this is the end of our broadcast and the end of the show. I thank you for joining us, and now stay with us as we continue our conversation on our digital platforms, Facebook and YouTube. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. We're on Facebook and YouTube with our post show, continuing our discussion on preserving Black books. Caroline, I owe you some time. Pick it up.
Yes, I was just mentioning how when I decided that I wanted to be a writer was when I was 27 years old, and I was reading books by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and I was reading Toni Morrison's Sula spoke to me, and Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. These are kind of like key texts in my life where I felt that, oh my goodness, I could actually do this from Malawi. There are all these African writers who are writing about their experiences. I know Chimamanda writes fiction more so than nonfiction, but it definitely was that beacon of hope for me to say, I too can produce material that is just as good. And so here I am speaking about my Malawian experiences in my writing.
Wow. And all those books are full circle. I mean, everything that you mentioned, I enjoyed. And I think over here in America, we were late to Chimamanda, and then of course, Beyonce also uplifted her as well. So I think she got new audiences after that pop culture reference. If people
I do want to say that the Hurston Wright Foundation gave Chimamanda a $10,000 award prize for her very first novel, Purple Hibiscus. So,
which I love. I love that book. I love that book.
Yeah, we were very early
that
supporters
that
and recognizers of her.
Well,
I most recently gave her an award last year, the North Star Award.
Oh my goodness, Marita, that book. Our book club loved it, and it just meant so much to me, and I know it meant a lot to Caroline as well. We all loved that book. So, again, without organizations like yours bringing attention to authors like her, maybe we would not have found her on our own. So I appreciate that greatly. So here's a question. We know that the publishing world, the major publishing houses, let me be clear, are 79% white. 79%. The next number, which is a little shocking to me, of how many Black folks are involved in the major housing publishing world, 5.6%. So it's a huge gap. I'm just wondering if you all think that the particularly this latest intense banning of Black books will have a chilling effect on authors that these major houses may support or select? Anybody can respond.
Well, without a question, I think it will be, because it's difficult enough bringing to the attention of these major publishers any work by people of color in the first place. And it's difficult to identify and find the people of color that work within these organizations. I speak from personal experience of attempt to get a memoir that I had written about my father published. And it's the opportunities are few and far between. And plus, these major publishing houses don't accept unsolicited material. You have to go through a literary agent, which is another story altogether. So chilling, it does not begin to describe what's likely to happen now.
Yeah, clearly, as the backlash continues, because publishers respond to the political situation, they will develop, for example, a conservative imprint, an imprint just for the authoritarian right-wing crowd, so that they can exploit that and profit financially from the backlash, the rightward turn, the more authoritarian turn in the country. And frankly, Callie, I was surprised. Those statistics seem small to you, but I was surprised it was that much. I was surprised
I was going to say,
5%.
Wow.
I was going to say the same thing. I mean, publishing so white, right? Hashtag, everybody knows that. So I'm actually surprised that it is that much. I would say it's less. And Marita's absolutely right that, bottom line, right? We live in a capitalist society. These publishing houses are in business to make money. And to the extent that they feel that their bottom line is threatened by these a backlash against these kind of books, then they will absolutely withdraw. And the fact that there won't be people internally advocating for the importance of these books is the problem, right? You have to have people at the table who say, this book is important. So many of the great novels we know, wouldn't have barely made it out anyway. Giovanni's Room, James Baldwin's second novel was rejected by his publisher and it had to go somewhere else, and on and on and on. And as we know, Marita, Hurston Wright, which is a great, I want to just hats off to, because it is an extraordinary organization and so important, right? Zora Neale Hurston went out of print. If it weren't for Alice Walker, we wouldn't know who Zora Neale Hurston was. None of us would have read Zora Neale Hurston had Alice Walker, a Black woman writer, not resurrected her. So we have to have seats at the table. Some of us who are working in colleges that train people who go into publishing are very much at the forefront of trying to encourage. But as Carmen talked about, part of the reason is that it's a very, it's expensive to live in New York, right? And if you don't have a trust fund, you can't go work as an intern at a publishing house, right? And, so the barriers are high and reproducing. But yeah, it's going to have a chilling effect.
Caroline, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I do. I bumped into a lot of this when publishing my first book, Well, What Kind of Girl? My second one is actually coming out this year, but just trying to get a publisher was very difficult. I had a lot of people kind of want me to change my narrative, and they really wanted me to get to the part where I'm in America and move away from, Africa, because yes, even though my book kind of dabbles in that, my desire to come to America to escape my own culture, that's the story I wanted to tell, the struggle that I had, not when I have arrived in America. That's my second book. So I struggled with publishers for the first one, or to even get a literary agent. They wanted me to change a lot of things, which I did not agree with. So I kind of stood up for myself until I had to take this route of using this hybrid approach where I kind of meet the publisher 50-50. And I published What Kind of Girl in that way. I published with Austin Macaulay Publishers. And the representation is very difficult right now, because when I market my book, everything that you might see about me, it's all me, very hands-on, very self-made. And getting an agent is a whole other story. I heard somebody say that, because yes, the way you tell your story, what they're looking for is somebody who already kind of has that platform out there, somebody who has a huge following. They're doing these talks. And I thought, wait a minute, aren't they supposed to help me get there?
No.
There's an expectation that you
No.
already have that.
Yeah.
I want to just share a quote from a rejection letter from an agent that a very fine writer that I spent 2 years working with on a beautiful memoir about coming of age, working class in Philly, becoming the best educated person in the family, and yet living with kidney disease for much of her adult life. So it's about coming of age, it's about being a Black woman, it's about the kidney disease journey. And so many Black people suffer with kidney disease. So we get this manuscript. It's really well written. We're proud of it. She starts sending it out to agents. One agent sends her back, oh, this is so well written. I really enjoyed reading this, but I'm going to have to tell you that we can't represent you because one, you don't have a huge Twitter presence, and they mean hundreds of thousands. Yes. You are not, and this is a quote, you don't have star appeal. Mm-hmm. You are not famous. And so we really love the book, but we can't represent you. So that what are you to do when you get that kind of response? So now I'm working with her on considering self-publishing, options. So it's the combination of the commercialization of the industry, narrowing the concept of who can get published, under 40, 1 million followers, and if you look at, for example, the very successful young Black writers who are published and do some research, they have a lot of Twitter followers. Absolutely. They graduated from a prestigious MFA program. So it's a whole, you think writing the book is hard. No, that's just the beginning.
Well, I have two responses. First of all, Zakiya Harris, a new young writer, debut novel, The Other Black Girl, is actually set in the publishing world and exposes much of what you're talking about.
And the publishing industry loves books about the publishing industry.
That's right.
Exactly.
They love books that are about them.
Right.
Even if they're books about them being racist.
Right.
The book is about them.
So there was that. The second story I will tell is from the late, great Gwen Ifill. Some of you know her as a long-standing anchor and reporter. And when she was writing her book, she couldn't get what she thought was good editorial feedback. She got it from peers, but not from the people that were working with her at the publishing house. So she went to New York to meet with them to say, I think we need to have a little bit more, deep conversation about how this is coming together. And she realized in the moment, as she said to me, they didn't really care what I wrote. She said, I could have gone to the board and written, I am Gwen Ifill 100 times, and they would say, that is great, because she had the following. Right. She had the platform.
That's what it's about.
So that's right.
That's true. Yeah, sorry. So we could have a long conversation about publishing because that's true across the board. But it is particularly true for writers of color, and it is a very challenging thing to keep young writers engaged and interested. The gatekeepers have a lot of power. That is true.
So here's a flip question. So I ask about the chilling effect of the publishing companies being overwhelmingly white. We had the summer of reckoning, after George Floyd's death, and it spurred a lot of support for Black bookstores and for Black written content, particularly by Black authors. Is there any long tail from that still? Are you all seeing that or have any hope for that? Because a lot of folks that found some of that material were, excited about it and then told other folks, and it's got picked up by schools and other places. So there was a boon, a little mini boon for authors in that moment. So I'm wondering, Marita, do you see any long tail from that, even if it's small?
Well, I think that that there's always going to be certain publishers, certain cultural institutions that are dedicated to, quote, diversity, equity, and Black stories, no matter what. And I think that it's those organizations, those bookstores, those people that will maintain the commitment even in the face of the backlash. Because the backlash, when I was seeing all these white people in the streets, silence is racism, and saw the Black bookstores almost not even able to keep up with the orders. I said, how long is this going to last? And I just something said the backlash is going to be brutal. And that is exactly what it is. But I am optimistic because every day I wake up and say, what did Frederick Douglass do? Oh, he did the same thing Monday that he did Sunday. What did Ida do? And so those of us who are dedicated to this, we will persevere. We will keep doing what we do, but I think that there is going to be shedding. There are going to be people who move to the next hot thing. But the most important thing is that those of us who are dedicated, we stay the course.
So now I have a question for all of you, because to a person, none of you are real excited about ebooks. And I have to say, I had not thought about ebooks in the context of preserving Black books. And what came out of the research for this discussion was, if the printed books are not available or in some numbers, there's a huge loss because you just don't keep it on ebooks. I'd like you all to respond to that. I really hadn't thought about that the printed copy actually becomes a double valuable piece because it is printed and there is a certain kind of content to preserve. So, Kim, I know you've been struggling with your students around ebooks and what they miss by not having the printed copy. Why don't you respond?
Yeah, I think it's two-part. One is I think, and my students dispute me on this, but I do think there's a different mechanism in your brain for comprehension from reading on print than reading online, right? And the example I give is that I teach incidents in the life of a slave girl, Harriet Jacobs' great memoir, slave narrative, right? And for a long time, I made my students buy it in hard copy, and you can make notes in the margin, you can underline, you can highlight, all of that kind of stuff. I finally gave in and let them get it online because it's in the public domain. And after I did that, I noticed I would put an extra credit question at the end of the quiz. What is the title of this narrative? They didn't know. They said it was Harriet Jacobs' narrative or memoir Harriet Jacobs. They didn't know the title because they hadn't actually looked at it, right? It hadn't imprinted on themselves. It's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And it's that kind of cognitive connection with the text that I think we're missing. So that's one thing. But you're absolutely right. Books will, right? I imagine, Carmen, most of the books that are the first editions I have a small collection of first editions, including a Langston Hughes, but it's hardcover. Even a paperback is not going to survive 100 years in the way that a hardcover would. And an ebook, right? They can, when the apocalypse comes, all those books are gone, right? So I think it is vital that we preserve our books, Black books, in print and even in hardcover for the next generations. When Baldwin said, when they're sifting among the ruins to begin again, they'll find me and begin again. They need the book to begin again, the actual book.
How do the rest of you feel?
Well, I agree, and that's why the hardcovers, the majority of the books that I've donated are hardcovers because that's what I would buy, quite frankly. And as cost became a factor much more recently, I would look to the public library to check out the book and go from there. But sometimes some of the books that are more popular, there's a waiting list. And while I'm glad there's a waiting list, I'm a slow reader, so I've got to get it. So as a last resort, the ebook is what I turn to. But for all of those reasons that it disappears, you can't turn the pages, you can't turn down one that is important to you. Just call me an old-fashioned girl. I like the actual book in my hand.
Marita?
I think there's.
Well, actually, I was surprised to know that my last novel, The White Circumference of Love, 3/4 of the copies were e-copies.
Really?
Yes. And we have to remember now that the very prescient conclusion of the book, Fahrenheit 451, about book burning, is that all the books are burned. But the people memorize the books. And they tell the story of those books to each generation. So that most people read both. I read hardbacks, paperbacks, I listen to Audible. And scientists have shown that there is a difference between how much you take in, understand, and process reading on a Kindle as opposed to reading a hardback.
Yeah.
The brain processes more in a hardback book. So that's concluded. But I think that American readers read hardback books at the same time that they read ebooks. But I just have to say, remember now, hardbacks can be burned. Stories here.
Oh my!
I was so pleased when I started working with my granddaughter, who's about 11, on her reading. And after only 2 or 3 weeks of talking with her, really intense conversation about a book, grades shot up. Grades shot up on reading. Took her to the bookstore one day and I said, okay, go get a book. She marched straight over to the book Never Captured. The book that was written about George Washington's pursuit of his enslaved woman. I don't know how she knew, but she marched over to the table, just picked the book up. Hallelujah. So the best thing we can do is buy a book, read it to a young person, take it to a bookstore, no matter what.
Caroline, before you weigh in, I'm just going to add one thing for you to ponder, Marita, about The Wide Circumference of Love, because that's a novel about Alzheimer's. And so I think that for those of us who have struggled around that might be the most accessible material. We're getting so much material about that particular book might be best served on ebooks for a lot of people. Just want to put that in.
That's a good point.
But I have your other ones in hardback, just saying. All right, Caroline.
I was just going to add on to what Kim had mentioned about kind of like the psychology that goes on when people are retaining information from a print copy versus ebook. There's something that's precious about owning your own physical copy of the book and just flipping the pages. I heard somebody say, it's like holding the world of the author, their ideas in your hands. And then you become connected with those words. You enter that world and it becomes a part of you, very real for you. And when I think of our classrooms, we're trying to not suck the reality out of education. We want them to have these experiences where education is not just a stale thing where you read a textbook and it's not even a part of you, but we find ways to make it mean something. And I think when we have those hard copies in class with them, it creates that connection. Another thing that I've also done is I started a GoFundMe page to raise funds so that I could send copies of What Kind of Girl to Malawi, because I wanted Malawian girls and boys to have a copy of my book in their hands and have that connection with my story as they're trying to figure out their own lives, to carry it around with them. And then word of mouth goes out and a lot of people will read the story because we don't have a lot of Malawian authors. We don't have women authors who are sharing their experiences. They're writing fiction. They're afraid to write about what they've lived. So having these physical copies out there, it was important to me, and it was my way of doing that preservation for them and giving them access that they did not have, because Amazon doesn't get to Malawi.
Yeah.
Well,
real briefly, just say that's the other thing about a paperback is that you can pass it on, right? That's how knowledge gets passed on and on. David Walker snuck his work into the South, David Walker's Appeal, and passed it from person to person and was read out loud to each other. That's how we pass knowledge. Right. That's how we share knowledge.
Well, that is an excellent place for us to stop. I so appreciate you all joining me. I'm all reading your stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.